You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 40.
The yetis were lying on their stomachs, having regrouped at the edge of the light near the runway. They all watched in silence as the commercial airliner descended from the night sky, touched down on the tarmac, then thundered towards them. As the plane loomed up, they all lowered their heads to make sure their furry white faces and blue eyes didn't inadvertently reflect a stray streak of light and catch the pilot's attention. After the starboard wingtip sailed over the yetis' heads, they slowly raised their eyes and watched the plane continue down the runway. "So Maine thinks this plane is the North Koreans," said Vander. "No," replied Shawkat. "What he said was, this plane is not scheduled to land. Looks like a normal plane to me," commented Sierra. "Me too," agreed Grint. "But if the North Koreans are on board, do you think they're traveling business class or economy? Even if it's economy, it's gotta be more comfortable than how we flew in," muttered Hassan. "I dunno about the rest of you, but I was freezing my furry nuts off as we flew down from the mountains." "I wasn't," said Zana flatly. Hassan winked at her. "Bet your other bits got cold though," he laughed. Shawkat watched a white four-wheel drive and a red fire truck race away from the terminal building, heading towards the plane. "Looks like some emergency services are heading out," he said. "The white vehicle's a security team," observed Grint. "Are they armed?" Shawkat asked. "I saw compact machine guns of some kind as they were getting in," Grint answered. Shawkat nodded. "So they might be expecting trouble," he mused. Grint shrugged and replied, "Or maybe just being cautious." The plane was most of a kilometer away at the far end of the runway. It turned towards the terminal building and taxied along at a slow speed. The vehicles approached the plane and stopped a short distance away. However, instead of stopping, the plane steered around them and continued on. This appeared to cause some brief consternation in the vehicles, after which the truck and the four-wheel drive did quick U-turns and trailed along after the plane's port side wing. "This looks a bit odd," said Simbara. "Yeah, it does," agreed Shawkat. "I think I saw the driver of the fire truck stick his hand out the window and give the pilots the middle finger," added Hassan. "Actually, I think the driver was pointing to the part of the terminal where the pilots could stop the plane," explained Zana. Hassan shrugged. "If you say so," he replied, "but it looked like the bird to me." From his vantage point inside the terminal, Maine did not see the interaction between the fire truck driver and the pilots, because his line of sight was blocked by another commercial aircraft that was parked near the terminal building. He had watched the plane land and proceed to the end of the runway, and now it was taxiing into closer proximity to the building. Mohawk, Gull, Pemba, and the 14-year-olds were standing beside him. "If that plane is full of killer North Korean soldiers," asked Twig, "should we be standing so close to it?" "We're not sure yet," replied Maine. Twigger raised one eyebrow and asked, "We're not sure if we should be standing so close." "We're not sure it's the North Korean assault force," Maine said. The plane halted about 20 meters from the terminal building, in the middle of the area in which passengers disembark from planes. The white four-wheel drive and the fire truck pulled up close to the nose of the plane, and then the vehicle's occupants got out and stood around, gesturing at the pilots, who ignored them. One man spoke animatedly on a walkie-talkie. The security staff had their arms crossed and looked more irritated than alarmed at the situation. The plane was blocking access to the terminal and would hold up the disembarkation of passengers from other flights. The door in the fuselage near the front of the plane suddenly swung open to reveal two figures dressed in black, crouching down in the door space. Each figure held a machine gun pointed at the men standing below on the tarmac. Maine began to roar, "Watch out," but his words were drowned out by the explosion of gunfire. Two bursts of flame spewed from the doorway, lighting up the night. The hail of bullets cut down the men standing on the tarmac and riddled the parked vehicles with ragged holes. One emergency services officer staggered away, but was shot in the back before he took a dozen steps from the plane. A rope was dropped out of the open doorway, and then a steady stream of black-masked soldiers quickly rappelled down to the ground. When their boots hit the tarmac, they fanned out around the plane, guns raised, establishing a secure perimeter. There was a moment of shocked silence before pandemonium erupted inside the terminal building. The walls echoed with hysterical shrieking as people scurried in every direction, unsure of where the gunshots had come from. Some dragged their luggage behind them, others dropped their bags and ran in sheer panic. The airport security staff were caught up in the waves of terrified masses. Maine shepherded the 14-year-olds behind a concrete wall and instructed everybody to crouch down. "I don't think there's any doubt about who's in that plane," he grunted. "What are we going to do?" asked Laheeti. I am going to find you a safe place where you are going to stay and lay low until all this is over like you promised, Maine said. That goes for Twig and Pemba too. It's pretty safe right here, Laheeti suggested. I had somewhere safer in mind, said Maine, like a long way away from the airport. Ah, I see, Laheeti said. And what are you going to do? When the soldiers come in here, Mohawk and I are going to take them aside, one at a time, and explain the error of their ways in language they can understand, Maine explained sarcastically. Laheeti frowned. You mean in North Korean? He asked uncertainly. Maine shook his head slowly, then slammed one huge fist into the palm of his other hand, grinding an imaginary enemy beneath his knuckles. Oh, Laheeti said, looking from Maine's sledgehammer-sized hands to his unblinking eyes, I get it. Can you and Mohawk really handle all those soldiers that just came out of the plane? We can try, Maine replied. What about Flat Top? Asked Twig. Maine stood up, towering over the teenagers. It was easy to believe that he could stop a whole army if he wanted to. Shawkat and his team are outside, he grunted. When Flat Top makes a run for the plane, it's their job to stop him. You mean we're just going to lie here and watch as those soldiers tear the airport apart? Asked Zaw incredulously. Pipe down, kid, hissed Shawkat. Our principal concern is to find Abby and Isabelle and get them safely out of here. You know that, helping the humans in the airport is not what we came here to do, even if one of the humans is a citizen of Shangri-La, Zaw asked. Pemba knew what he was getting himself into and was well prepared, Shawkat said. He and the other teenagers are probably hiding behind a toilet bowl right now, far away from the shooting. It's unlikely the North Koreans will take any interest in them provided they keep their heads down like they were told to do. Shawkat glanced over at the rambunctious teenage yeti. Look, I'm not happy about it either, he added. My team and I spend our days saving wayward humans in the mountains. The last thing we want to see is a bunch of them getting shot to pieces, but we've got to keep our minds on the job. There's too much at stake here to get sidetracked. Zaw watched as a dozen or more black-clad soldiers crossed the tarmac to the building. There, they split up into several teams, blasted open 3 entry doors, and proceeded inside. More gunshots rang out in the night as the airport security officers in the building opened fire. A second squad of soldiers had taken up positions around the aircraft to defend it against attack while they waited for Flat Top to show himself. Zaw counted a dozen of them, including 2 men operating large tripod-mounted machine guns. There was no telling how many more soldiers were still inside the plane. Maine and Mohawk are majorly outgunned, observed Zaw. They'll find a way to deal with it, replied Shawkat. The North Korean Squad 2 leader slapped a new clip into his submachine gun and stepped over the twitching body of the security officer. The officer was bleeding heavily from multiple wounds to his chest and stomach, but he wasn't dead yet. 5 more North Korean soldiers stepped over him, without so much as a downward glance at the man. The Squad 2 leader moved stealthily down the corridor, gun raised, then proceeded into the mayhem of the public areas of the building. He and his squad immediately took up defensive positions behind solid steel columns and exchanged gunfire with security officers standing near the running crowd. After sneaking a quick look, the Squad 2 leader thrust his weapon out and blindly fired in their direction, emptying the clip in less than a second. 2 other soldiers followed suit. The shots raked across the crowd, killing both security officers as well as 5 civilians who were running for their lives. One man with blood smeared down his face stopped and stumbled back, picked up his dying daughter and cradled her in his arms. His despairing moans went unheard in the cacophony of noise. The Squad 2 leader took his team through a series of corridors, killing anybody who stood in their way. Soon they came to the central control room. A nod from the squad leader and one soldier checked the door. It was locked. Standing back, he directed a short burst of fire at the lock. A third kicked the door open, then 2 more soldiers lobbed in grenades and stood back against the wall. There was a brief bout of panicked yelling from inside the room then. Kaboom! A gray plume of dust billowed from the doorway. The soldiers waited for the smoke to clear, then slipped inside the room, moving slowly and carefully, their eyes coldly assessing the bodies that lay sprawled on the floor and over the computer consoles. The bank of television monitors on the far wall had been blackened and cracked by the grenade explosion. 2 still worked, displaying the chaos raging in the airport. The images showed bodies of men, women, and children lying everywhere. The squad leader noted with satisfaction that the airport security officers were no match for the superior North Korean forces. One dying man lying on the floor of the control room coughed and was immediately shot. Another man groaned and managed to lever himself up into a sitting position, leaning weakly against a gray filing cabinet. His left arm and leg were badly injured. The squad leader noted the uniform and crouched down near the man. "Are you chief of airport security?" he asked in fractured English. The man struggled to focus his eyes. "Who are you?" he groaned, controlling a sudden impulse to rip out the man's tongue using the pliers he carried for just that purpose. The squad leader patiently asked his question again. The man's head lolled to the side. "Yes," he answered weakly, "and who are?" The squad leader shot him in the head, cutting off his question. Then he stood up and spoke into his radio, reporting that his squad had destroyed the control room and killed the chief of security, as ordered. The mission commander, who was still on board the plane, instructed the squad to proceed to neutralize any remaining resistance in the airport. During a brief pause in the shooting, Gull and the two GXs shepherded the teenagers across an open area on the ground floor. Staying low, they hurried around the bodies and blood puddles, then hid behind one of the check-in counters. The staff who usually worked there were nowhere to be seen. Beneath the computer consoles were some drawers which Twig opened and rifled through. He found a pocket knife which, due to airport regulations, some traveler probably had to part with before boarding a plane. "What are you going to do with that?" asked Laheeti. Twig shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "Might be handy." "For what?" "Opening letters," Laheeti asked. Twig made low stabbing motions with the knife. "Maybe I can jab 'em in the shins if they come too close," he suggested. "Hopefully they won't get so close that you have to do that," Laheeti replied. Gulbenkian had been watching the teenagers. "You just brought a knife to a gunfight," he whispered. "A time-honored mistake. That's only partly true," replied Twig. "I brought a knife, 2 genetically engineered super soldiers, and a bunch of really angry yetis." Gull chuckled quietly. "That does even up the odds a bit," he conceded. There was more gunfire from somewhere to the left of where they were hiding. Maine peered around the edge of the counter and saw 2 North Korean soldiers firing from the hip at several security guards. The innocent civilians caught in the crossfire were being torn apart by the hail of bullets. Maine looked at his brother. "This has gone on for long enough," he muttered. Mohawk nodded in agreement. They emerged from behind the counter, hurried across to a trolley rack and ripped 2 trolleys out of the locking rail. The sound of continued gunfire covered the rending sound as steel was ripped from steel. "I'll pay for that damage when all of this is over," said Mohawk. "Forget about it," Maine replied. "These things should be free anyway." The North Korean soldiers were so focused on killing the airport security staff and any civilians who got in the way that they didn't notice the 2 silver-haired giants moving closer. Like a 10-pin bowler holding a 16-pound ball, Maine swung his arm back in a giant backswing, then let rip, flinging the trolley towards one hapless soldier. Mohawk did the same, releasing his trolley a heartbeat after his brother. The silver objects rocketed across the floor and slammed into the soldiers, knocking them from their feet and silencing their guns. They collapsed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. By the time they had risen unsteadily to their hands and knees, the GXs were upon them, knocking both senseless. Maine bent down to pick up the weapons. As he did so, in his peripheral vision he spied 2 more soldiers emerge from the screaming crowd in the distance and bring their guns to bear on him. A lifetime of training in an elite North Korean military academy may have warped his mind, but it had given him the reactions of a mongoose that no philosophical change of heart could ever dull. In a flash he grabbed the machine gun and rolled forward, curling his index finger around the trigger as he did so. Shots rang out, peppering the tiles around him and his brother, who leapt for cover. As Maine completed the maneuver, his boots slammed into the ground, his head came up and his attackers appeared squarely in front of the crosshairs of his gun. Maine fired 2 shots, dropping both of the soldiers to the ground with twin taps to the head. They were dead by the time they hit the tiles. He stood up, picked up the other machine gun and tossed it to his brother. Mohawk caught it and checked the clip. Half full, he found extra clips on the bodies and pocketed them. More than enough to knock the grins off the soldiers' faces. "Nicely done," said Mohawk. Maine shrugged modestly. "Old habits die hard," he explained. "Harder than the soldiers round here, by the looks of things," Mohawk remarked. "This is the last time, though," Maine added. "I'm done with the soldiering business." Mohawk nodded. "Yes," he said, "just one more time to make things right for Shangri-La." "I just had a bad thought," said Maine. "Didn't the Shangri-La Council say we're not supposed to use guns?" "I thought those rules only applied to the yetis," Mohawk suggested. Maine shook his head. "No, I think they apply to us as well," he mused. Mohawk paused and then said, "Let's just say we misunderstood." Maine was perfectly comfortable with that. Agreed, he replied. Twig came out from behind the counter and looked over at the two fallen soldiers. He knew the answer, but he asked anyway. Are they, dead? The tremble in Twig's voice caused Maine to ponder the wisdom of bringing the teenagers along on the mission. The Islander kid had probably never seen a dead body before, let alone two of them gunned down in the heat of battle. It was the sort of stuff that gave grown men and women nightmares. Personally, Maine never lost a wink of sleep, but he could understand how others did. The sooner the teenagers were out of the airport, the better. It was them or us, Maine replied in a matter-of-fact voice. But they're soldiers, Twig said. They were just following orders. A soldier can always choose to disobey an order that he knows in his heart is wrong, Maine explained. Twigger frowned. Even if he will be punished for it, he asked. Maine shrugged. I didn't say that disobeying the order would necessarily work out well for the soldier, he added. But tonight is the last time we do this, said Mohawk. And hopefully we won't have to kill any more soldiers before we find Abby and Isabelle. Right, Maine. Maine nodded in earnest agreement. Right, he stated. And if you do have to kill any more soldiers, asked Twig. Well, it's not our fault, Maine said, jabbing his thumb in the direction of the two dead soldiers. Because they started it. An explosion of gunfire to their right silenced the conversation. The floor around their feet splintered as bullets blasted across the area. They all hurried behind the counter and took cover. This counter isn't going to keep them at bay for long, hissed Mohawk, tightening his grip on his machine gun. Maine nodded and activated the button mic on his jacket. Shawkat, we could really use some backup, he said. There are a lot of them and not many of us. Over. There was a hiss of static in Maine's earpiece but no reply. Shawkat, Maine repeated. Another hiss followed by the Yeti's voice, a half-growl saying, I'm thinking about it. Great, muttered Maine, glancing at his brother. We're getting shot at and he's thinking about it. In the darkness near the runway, the Yetis were still lying on their chests, keeping watch for Flat Top and also observing the soldiers around the North Korean plane on the runway. A team of them were in the process of attaching one end of a fuel line to the underside of the aircraft and the other end to a truck carrying a large quantity of aviation gas. Zaw, having heard the transaction between Maine and Shawkat, rolled closer to the Yeti team leader. What are we waiting for? The teenage Yeti hissed. They need our help in there. Get back in your place and keep your head down, replied Shawkat. Not until you let me go into the airport, Zaw snapped back. Forget it, Shawkat replied gruffly, then returned his attention to the plane in the distance. Zaw stared at the big Yeti's profile in the darkness. What? He exclaimed. They said they're in trouble, we can't just leave them there. I said get back in your place, kid, snarled Shawkat. I don't have to explain myself to you. My friend is in there, Zaw hissed, so you'd like to charge in and help him, is that right? Shawkat asked. Zaw nodded vigorously. Right, he declared. What about your sister? Queried Shawkat. Zaw paused, then asked, What do you mean? I thought you would be more focused on saving her, Shawkat said pointedly. She being your sister and all, I want to save them both, Zaw replied emphatically. The entire Yeti team is out here to save her. Nobody's in the airport to help Pemba and the others. Pemba's got the GXs to look after him. He doesn't need saving, Shawkat suggested. You heard what Maine said, hissed Zaw. They're outnumbered, and you heard what I said earlier. Our principal concern is to save Abby and Isabelle, Shawkat said. The people in the airport are not our problem. I can't believe this, spat Zaw. Sometimes being in charge means making hard choices, kid, Shawkat said. He pointed a furry finger at the terminal in the distance. Look at all those lights. The building is lit up like it's the middle of the day. Do you think you'll be able to just disappear when you get inside? You're bound to be seen by the soldiers or the civilians. That's why we're staying put. So shut up and keep watching the plane. 10 minutes later, the GXs had managed to kill 2 more soldiers, but had not managed to shepherd the teenagers to a safe place outside the airport. They were all still pinned down on the ground floor, near the check-in counter, exchanging shots with multiple soldiers. The Squad 2 leader got a good look at the assailants. They were the North Korean commandos codenamed Mohawk and Maine, both physically identical to Flat Top. Except for their hairstyles, the squad leader had read the mission brief, but now that he was looking at the 2 giants, he couldn't believe his eyes. They were both sporting some kind of punk rock look that frankly disgusted him. One fool was strutting around with a ridiculous vertical grill of hair like a deranged peacock, and the other looked like an ape wearing a woman's wig. Why 2 grown men would choose to adopt such embarrassing appearances was beyond understanding. It was just that kind of sick personal freedom and rank exhibitionism that was rotting Western society to its stinking core. No wonder the Grand Marshal wanted to get rid of Mohawk and Maine. They represented everything that was wrong with capitalism, democracy, and the free world, and they were but ugly as well. The problem was they could shoot. They had killed at least 6 soldiers and didn't seem to be running out of bullets. The squad leader got on the radio to the commander and explained the situation. "You know your orders," barked the commander. "Mohawk and Maine are to be captured or killed." "Yes, sir," the squad leader replied. "However, they have killed several of my men and are, proving to be difficult targets." There was a pause, then the mission commander said, "The one named Maine doesn't operate well in the dark, so cut the lights and switch over to night vision. This should give your men the advantage they need to finish them off. I want their bodies brought back to the plane or burned." The squad leader acknowledged the order, then sent 2 soldiers to the basement to blow the power grid. Less than a minute later, there were several muffled explosions, after which all of the lights in the terminal building suddenly flickered and died, casting the building into almost total darkness. One by one, the soldiers slid their night vision goggles down over their faces and adjusted the settings. Their surroundings, the bodies and the blood pools now appeared in various shades of luminous green. Outside, the string of lights lining the runway also switched off. The airport and the vast surrounding grounds became an oasis of blackness in the middle of the brightly lit city of Kathmandu. The Yetis watched with interest as the airport building became black as night and the bright lights along the edge of the runway faded away. "Somebody blew up all the circuits in the lower level," observed Hassan. "Those lights aren't coming on any time soon." Zaw looked at Shawkat pointedly. "Now may I go in?" he asked. The Yeti team leader chewed over his reply. "Yes," he said finally, "but not alone. Sierra and Hassan will go with you. Take care of the soldiers inside, see that Pemba and the others are safe, then return here as fast as you can." Sierra and Hassan nodded. As they and Zaw slipped away, the rest of the Yeti team surreptitiously crossed the now darkened runway and took up positions in the short grass on the other side, creeping closer to the North Korean plane and the soldiers who were patrolling the area around it. Sierra, Hassan, and Zaw ran in a southerly direction, then looped northwards towards the airport building, making sure that none of the soldiers moving around on the tarmac saw what they were doing. When they arrived at the southern side of the terminal building, they were hardly out of breath. Despite having run about 800 meters over rough ground in half the time it would take an Olympic sprinter to cover that distance on a running track. Hassan quickly found a drain pipe that was firmly bolted onto the brick wall. He scaled that up to the first floor, then climbed across the wall to a large window. Sierra and Zaw followed him. Hanging onto the bricks with one hand and 2 feet, Hassan sliced out the window pane with 4 quick slashes from an index claw, then watched as the large glass sheet fell to the soil below with a dull thud. He swung himself through the open window, landing soundlessly on the carpet. Crouching down, he glanced around. His superior vision allowed him to see almost as much detail in the darkened room as he could if the lights were on. As far as he could tell, he was in a restaurant. He saw tables and chairs, broken plates and drinking glasses, and cutlery all over the floor. Had Hassan been more familiar with the airport, he would have known that he had entered the VIP room on the first floor, a comfortable place for well-heeled travelers to relax, have a bite to eat, and wait to board their flights. To his right, he saw 2 human men in business suits lying on the floor, unmoving. He sniffed the air. No need to check for a pulse. They had only been there for a short time, but already he could smell the death on them. He could also smell something else, coming from an area of the room that was obscured from his view. When Sierra and Zaw slipped inside next to him, he gestured that they should take to the roof and work their way around the corner. The 2 Yetis sniffed the air and knew exactly what he was talking about. Stealthily climbing directly up to the ceiling, they moved around the wall with inhuman speed and agility. Wearing their black togas, they were invisible in the darkness. Hassan stopped and peered around the corner. 4 North Koreans were moving through the room slowly, scanning their surroundings through bulky night vision goggles that covered their eyes. The Yeti watched them until he was satisfied that the soldiers would not notice him from his position near the ceiling. Not surprisingly, their attention was squarely focused on their surroundings on the ground. They paid no attention to what was going on over their heads. That suited Hassan just fine. He crept out slowly, moving along the wall like a giant 4-legged spider hunting its prey. As he did so, he reached into the folds of his toga and withdrew a small tranquilizer gun. The same make and model as those used by Kang and his rescue team. Moments later, one soldier was only meters away. Hassan sprang, his huge clawed feet hit the ground with a loud thud, then he grabbed the soldier under the arms and leapt into the darkness. It all happened so fast that the man didn't even have time to struggle. The yeti landed on the other side of the room and jabbed the tranquilizer into his neck, rendering him unconscious immediately. Hassan dropped the sleeping soldier on the carpet, then sprang back into the air, heading straight for the second soldier, who was glancing around warily, having heard something but not sure what it was. "That's strange," the soldier thought to himself. "I could have sworn my compatriot was standing right there a moment ago." Hassan landed on his back, flattening him to the ground and knocking over chairs. The third soldier, standing about 6 meters away, spun around and jerked his gun up in readiness to fire. Too slow. Sierra leapt down, wrapped one muscular arm around his neck, silencing the man's scream before it left his throat, and jumped away into the darkness with the helpless soldier still in his vice-like grip. Then Zaw rocketed down, knocking the fourth soldier to the ground with his shoulder. As the man gasped for breath, Zaw jabbed a tranquilizer into his neck and put him to sleep. The 3 yetis stood back and examined their handiwork. Zaw bent down and took the night vision goggles off an unconscious soldier. "They don't see too well with these things, do they?" he mused. "No," replied Hassan, "but don't underestimate them. One lucky bullet is all it takes, and you'll be lying on the ground next to them." Zaw stared through the goggles for a few seconds, fiddling with the buttons. Then he tossed them onto the chest of the sleeping soldier. "Yeah, well, their luck ran out the day they decided to grab my sister," he replied sternly. "Just keep your wits about you," Hassan cautioned. They turned to leave. As Hassan moved past the last soldier, he picked up the discarded weapon, a large rocket-propelled grenade launcher. He adjusted the black strap, slung the weapon over his shoulder, then caught up with Sierra and Zaw. When the airport building was thrown into darkness, Gulbenkian and the others held their breath and waited to see if the lights came back on. The entire terminal was silent for a while, and then the soldiers resumed their progress, firing even more indiscriminately than they were before the lights went out. Gulbenkian put his arms around Laheeti and Twig and drew them closer. After several minutes, the humans' eyes adjusted to the darkness, but they could still barely see their hands in front of their faces. The GXs, blessed by way of test tube with superior vision, could see better, but they conceded to each other in whispered tones that they were now at something of a disadvantage. Up till that point, the soldiers had been easy marks, but fighting in the dark put a whole new spin on things. They could only see clearly at close range, so if there were any snipers around, they would be able to take their time, watching and waiting for an opportunity to pick off targets one by one. That was the first problem. The second one was that ever since the lights went out, Maine had gotten a bad case of the shakes. They all felt better when they heard Hassan's voice in their earpieces, saying that he was in the airport with others and they were making their way through a lounge on the first floor. "How many yetis are here?" whispered Laheeti. "3, I think," replied Twig. "Is that all?" Laheeti said. "You might have to use that pocket knife after all." "Did the yetis or the soldiers take the lights out?" asked Pemba. "The soldiers, I think," said Laheeti. "If that's the case, they must think it gives them an advantage," Pemba replied. "I guess they didn't reckon on there being a bunch of yetis waiting for them." "It does give them an advantage," stuttered Gull. "Against us." "I agree," said Mohawk. "No doubt the soldiers are using night vision equipment, whereas we have to feel our way around. Perhaps the smart thing for us to do is to stay put and wait for Hassan and Sierra to take out all the soldiers." "That sounds kind of, cowardly," said Laheeti. "And perhaps not so smart either," added Twig. "We are sitting ducks here, and we don't know how long the yetis will take to get rid of the soldiers. The longer we sit here in the dark, the greater the risk that—" "Well, something bad will happen to us." "You're jumping ahead of me," said Mohawk. "I said the smart thing to do was to sit tight, but I didn't say I was gonna do the smart thing." Twigger nodded sagely. "No, you didn't," he said. Mohawk smiled in the darkness. "You know that saying, fortune favors the brave. I think we should go with that option and try and make it to the terminal entrance now." There was a brief, whispered discussion around the circle, weighing up the pros and cons. Laheeti turned to Mohawk, a hulking black shape in front of the diminutive teenage prince. "Just promise me one thing," he said. "You're not going to stop being soldiers until the night is over. So if anything gets in our way on the way out, you're going to blow it away." "Right," Mohawk nodded. "Right," he stated, as the only person in the group who was both A, an adult, and B, 100% human. The final decision about the teenagers' welfare fell to Gull. He thought about it for a moment, then declared that they should go for it. Gull and the teenagers all held hands, forming a human chain. It was intended to help them stay together, but in the absence of eye contact in the darkness, the physical contact was also a source of reassurance. The GXs peered around the edge of the counter, checking their surroundings. About 20 meters distant, Maine could just make out silhouettes, moving too calmly and slowly to be civilians, step onto the stopped escalator and begin to ascend. When the soldiers had moved higher, out of his line of sight, he and Mohawk crept out from behind the counter, followed closely by the rest of the group. At that very moment, one floor up, Zaw was in midair, 2 meters off the ground and completing a forward somersault that resulted in both of his clawed feet slamming into the chest of a soldier and flattening him on the ground. The man's mouth gaped open in surprise and remained that way as Zaw planted the tranquilizer gun against his neck and put him to sleep. Sierra and Hassan came up beside Zaw as he was returning the small tranq gun to its pouch in his toga. "Nicely done," said Hassan, "but would you mind letting one of us go first? We are, after all, the only qualified Yeti soldiers here." "I'm helping you both save your energy for the real fight," Zaw explained. Hassan looked skeptical. "The real fight?" he asked. "Against Flat Top," Zaw added. "That's very thoughtful of you," Hassan said, "but I'd rather you hang back and let us take the lead." Satisfied that he'd made his point, Hassan stepped over the soldier and continued down the corridor. Sierra and Zaw followed. As they neared the end of the corridor, they heard the footfalls of one or more people slowly ascending the escalator, probably guards, mouthed Hassan. "Let's wait for them to step off the escalator and then." As Hassan was whispering, Zaw sidestepped the 2 bigger yetis and dashed ahead. After taking half a dozen steps, he leapt onto the wall to his left, running horizontally along the vertical surface until he was directly opposite the entry point to the escalator. Then in one fluid motion, he jumped off the wall, sailed through the air with his toga billowing behind him like a giant black bird of prey, and landed on the long, narrow stainless steel shelf that ran down the length of the escalator at the height of the black rubber handrail. When his toga-covered backside hit the stainless steel, he slid forward, rapidly accelerating towards the soldiers who had paused mid-step and were madly trying to bring the crosshairs of their guns to bear on the moving green blur that was coming straight for them. They had less than a second to react, and it wasn't enough. Zaw shot down the side of the escalator, never taking his eyes off the soldiers. As he raced past them, he reached out with his right hand and slapped them both on the face. A blow which, had it come from a human being, would have rocked the soldiers back on their heels and left a bruise. However, Zaw was stronger, faster, and sharper than a human. His claws, fully extended, sliced the men's night vision goggles to pieces and cut long slashes along their unprotected cheeks. They fell back, tumbling awkwardly down the escalator to the bottom step, where Zaw was waiting to give them a tranq shot in the neck. Hassan and Sierra bounded down the escalator 3 steps at a time and stopped at the bottom, glancing at the fallen soldiers. Hassan gave Zaw a stern glance. "I see I didn't make myself clear when I told you to let us take the lead," he growled. "I would have, but there wasn't time," Zaw replied innocently. "The soldiers were only seconds away." "There wasn't time," Hassan repeated skeptically. "Right," Zaw stated. "You ran all the way to the end of the corridor, then slid halfway down an escalator to get to them," said Hassan. "That's true." "But did you see how fast I was?" Zaw exclaimed. Gesturing excitedly, he reenacted his leap from the wall to the escalator. Boom, straight down the escalator in one jump. Those soldiers were waving their guns around like they were trying to shoot a swarm of fireflies. "A whole battalion of 'em wouldn't have been able to hit me," Hassan sighed. "You've got the moves, kid, and the confidence," he said. "You'll make a great addition to Shawkat's team when you're older, provided you live that long." There was a soft rustle. Sierra turned his head slightly, listening carefully. When he heard it a second time, he peered into the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. After a few moments, he discerned a motley collection of silhouettes inching their way towards the escalator. It was the GXs and the others. Sierra, speaking into the button mic, hissed, "Mohawk, we're over here." "Look to your right." Mohawk paused and stared, then recognized the 3 yetis. He led the group across the floor to a place near the escalator. The yetis joined them. Maine kept a lookout for trouble. After Mohawk thanked them for coming to their aid, Zaw moved the conversation along to a more serious topic. "How many have you and Maine taken out?" he inquired. Mohawk looked confused. "How many what?" he asked. "Soldiers, of course," Zaw said. Mohawk tallied the numbers using his chunky fingers. 7, I think, he stated. "Same for us," replied Zaw. "But there are 3 of you and only 2 of us," said Maine, speaking over his shoulder. "So our ratio is higher." "That's true, but you've both been in here longer," Zaw countered. "Give us 10 minutes more and we'll double your tally." Hassan shook his head. "The only tally that matters is that every one of us, and Abby and Isabelle, makes it out of here in one piece by the end of the night," he said. So how about we stay focused on what really matters? Speaking of which, said Mohawk, what's your plan from here? Sierra and I are going to check on the North Korean plane, and Zaw is going to accompany you to the entrance of the building, Hassan said. This was news to Zaw, who had been under the impression that Hassan and Sierra would also be escorting the humans out of the airport. He was fine with the fact that he alone was going with the humans, because his purpose for coming into the airport was to make sure Pemba got out safely. But he was curious about what Hassan and Sierra had planned. So what are you two gonna do to the plane? He asked. The two yetis exchanged a glance, and then Hassan said, throw a spanner in the works. Once that's done, we'll make our way towards you unless you've already left the airport. Mohawk nodded and didn't ask any more questions. Whatever the yetis had planned was their business. Tactically, taking out the plane was the right thing for the yetis to do. There was no way the North Koreans could take Abby and Isabelle out of Nepal if their exit strategy was a smoking pile of ruins on the tarmac. With that, the two groups went their separate ways. Hassan and Sierra quickly disappeared into the darkness, moving soundlessly despite their hulking size. The GXs watched them go, then directed their young charges in the opposite direction. Gulbenkian stayed close to Laheeti and Zaw stayed close to Pemba. Twig, who was without a dedicated protector, stuck close to the GXs. He figured that if the snow really hit the fan, the safest place was right by their sides.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.